Scott Dyer, welcome to Mormon Discussion Podcast. How are you this morning?
Doing great. Thank you for having me.
Good. I'm kind of operating this morning, kind of representing the conglomerate of Mormon Discussion Incorporated, the nonprofit that runs multiple podcasts, because we have just added you as a host under the umbrella, under the podcast name Rameumptom Ruminations. And this has intrigued me. This has been kind of interesting as you and I have gotten to know each other a little bit. And you've sent me a little material, and I just thought you're doing a great job here on the front end. And you and I kind of kept the conversation going, and you decided to team up with Mormon Discussion, the umbrella, and create a podcast under us. And we're excited. We just want to kind of talk about your journey today and talk about what this podcast will look like, what people can expect, what kinds of ideas are ruminating in your head. And so let's start off with, why don't you share a little bit about your background? Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk a little bit about your faith journey.
Okay. So I was born and raised Mormon. I'm from the Pacific Northwest. I live near Portland, Oregon. My journey's the same as most people, honestly, as you listen to a lot of the Mormon Stories podcast and as you discourse with people in this realm, we've all had so many similar experiences. And so mine boils down to about the same as everybody else's. You know, I had a great childhood, loved the church growing up, and then experienced some trauma later in my life and found that the church didn't work for me anymore. But I didn't give up on it right away, if you will. As far as that goes, I was active in the church the majority of my life. I'm in my 30s, so that's as far as my intelligent life is about 20 years of comprehending the religion and obeying it as that goes. From there, I served a mission in Chile. That was back in 2008. My old mission president is actually in the Quorum of the 70 now. Let's see.
How was your mission?
You know, I will discuss my mission in detail because I had some very hard to reconcile experiences, both on the extremely spiritual side and on the extremely negative side. I saw what at the time I recognized to be real miracles, and not just the kind that you would hear in general conference anymore, but like legit miracles. And I still don't know how to exactly reconcile those in my head. I'll give one example of something that happened. So when I was in one area, in South America, you baptize a lot of people. And so in this particular area, I had baptized, I think every week I had baptized at least one person, and it had been, I don't know, coming up on like 3 months in this area. And my last week there, I was baptizing this woman that I had been teaching the entire time that I was there. She was just so hard to actually convince to get baptized. So the time comes, we get to the chapel, we're getting everything ready a couple hours before. There's no power and the water is shut off. And, you know, being a believer at the time, I'm like, okay, I can handle this. You know, I just need a little bit of Lord on my side. And I use it as a teaching experience for my companion that was with me at the time. And we knelt down and we prayed. And I just said, all right, Heavenly Father, I can do one of these things, but I really need you to do the other one. It's like, I can get water. I don't know how, but I'll figure it out. If you could turn the lights on, I will do the water part. And as soon as we ended the prayer, the lights turned on in the chapel. And I was like, okay, I guess I got to figure this water part out. And what I ended up doing is I called the fire department. And I was like, hey, look, we're running into a situation. Could you come and fill up the baptismal font for us real quick? And they were like, this isn't really what we do, but I mean, we don't have anything going, so sure. And then the fire department came up to the chapel and filled the baptismal font for us.
Wow.
And so, yeah, just kind of crazy. But at the time, that was so spiritually fulfilling for me. But looking back at a lot of these experiences now, they're really hard to reconcile. On the one hand, it was deeply impactful, and at the time I knew where these things came from, but now I don't. And I exist in a space where I don't know the answers to a lot of questions, and that's okay.
Yeah, you know, I like that. And I like that comes into your background, because I think that helps you in lots of ways recognize like, hey, from that TBM, that orthodox perspective, like those folks have evidence for why they believe the way they do too. And so when you enter this place of being more nuanced, whether in or out of the church, recognizing that there are sincere experiences on that other side that give weight to that ground that they hold, I think it helps us all to be more respectful as the conversation is ensuing. I'm curious, when do things start to get tricky for you? When do they get messy? When do things get complicated in
Yeah.
Mormonism?
So for me, my deconstruction process was chronological, if you will. I love history, and I've always been just like a history enthusiast. I minored in it in school. I went to BYU, Idaho, and I've always been a nerd. I read a lot of fantasy books, but I read a lot of history books too. And I was studying Egyptian history for a time and listening to this podcast. I think it's called The Ancient World, but the host is Scott Chesworth. So I was listening to the Ancient World podcast, and he just kind of does an overview of all of the oldest civilizations. And I was reading some books about Egyptian history, and in one of the books I was reading, the author just kind of made an offhand comment like, the people that believe Moses existed place him here. And I was like, believe Moses existed? What are you talking about? And that started me down this long rabbit hole of biblical historicity. And within a month or two, I no longer believed that anything in the Old Testament was history. But I still believed in the New Testament, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants. And my deconstruction proceeded forward in time from there. So the next was the New Testament. And then I held on to a belief in the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants for a long time. I existed in a space where I read the Old Testament more as like allegory and like spiritual myth stories. And I found value in them, and I worshiped God, and I existed in a space where it didn't have to be real, but that place is hard to be in and be Mormon. I really wasn't able to talk about any of my thoughts or any of the things that were on my mind, which made it difficult because I was the gospel doctrine teacher for a number of years, teaching Old Testament, teaching New Testament, while not believing that any of them were true, like accurate portrayals of history. So I danced around words, I skirted things as best I could, but anytime I got close to really saying what I thought, I did push the idea with the story of Jonah, because it's just so outrageous that, how could you believe that that's literal anyway? And I got backlash from it. People didn't like the way I portrayed it. And here I'm thinking, like, this is clearly a story that they created like much later anyway.
Mormonism in terms of the 3-hour block and how the leaders have, again, it's fluid, but how they have organized church to look, and the way they've made the manuals in terms of what they teach, what kinds of questions are allowed. Mormons, because of all of that baggage, aren't very good at welcoming biblical criticism, are they?
No, not at all. And I did my best to introduce it softly, but there's not a space for it.
Yeah.
And I wasn't released because I was teaching bad stuff. I feel like I did a really good job about dancing around what I really thought, because after that I got called into a stake young men's position. so I must have been doing something right, at least as far as the church goes. But it was a really hard time to both be deconstructing the biblical historicity and teaching it at the same time.
Yeah, no, very much so. I remember reading those things too, and there was no place to really share them. And if you shared a little bit, people got excited because here's the guy sharing new things that nobody in the room knows.
Yeah.
So long as everything you share doesn't run counter to their sacred stories. But as you point out, you get too far. And so you end up being the only guy in the room who kind of knows these things. There's no way to get them across. You keep reading and thinking and learning, and you've got no place to share it, which here we are often leads us to finding other outlets to have these conversations and to begin talking about things that matter to us that no one seems in our personal space to want to be listening to.
Yeah, exactly. And that is a great way to put it. So I couldn't have these discussions with anybody in church, but I quickly found that I could talk openly with a close friend that I had made. And And he's important to my journey. He's one of my best friends that I met through church, and we're still close friends today. He was my home teacher at the time, and I think he visited me once or twice on like official home teaching capacity. But I have played Dungeons and Dragons since I was a kid, and I still play weekly, as weekly as I can. We're taking a little break during the summer months, but this guy plays. I invited him to play Dungeons and Dragons with me, and so we start playing regularly. And after one of our sessions, he pulls me aside because he had heard some of the things that I've been commenting, and maybe the verbiage that I'd used to explain something in gospel doctrine. And he pulls me aside and he's like, dude, can we talk for a sec? And I was like, yeah, sure. And this started these gospel-centered conversations after Dungeons and Dragons. And so we'd play Dungeons and Dragons for a couple hours, and then everybody else would leave. Me and this guy, we'd chat scriptures for hours after, and sometimes like really late into the night. And it was nice to be able to talk openly, because he was sharing openly where he was, and he was telling me that he no longer believed at all. And I was just fascinated that I could actually talk to someone that wasn't going to judge me for how I thought. And it led to some really good conversation. And and this eventually led to the whole thing crashing. So here we are, we're chatting in his living room one late evening. It's probably like 1 a.m. after everybody else had gone, and we're just talking really late into the night. And he and I are chatting about biblical historicity at this time, and we're talking about the flood and the Tower of Babel and all of these stories. And I've read Epic of Gilgamesh, and I've read, some excerpts from Enuma Elish. And so I was telling him, and just kind of like how frustrated I was that I couldn't actually teach these things in gospel doctrine. And he was like, those stories are mentioned in the Book of Mormon, right? And like, until he asked me that question, it just had never made the connection that these same stories were treated as history in the Book of Mormon. And it just the light switch moment where the minute he asked me that, I no longer believed. It was like 1 second to the next.
Yeah,
then
Tower
the whole thing
Babel,
crashed.
Tower Babel, the global flood, right? Those kinds of things get some press time in those pages, and it makes it that you have to kind of wrestle with not only the absurdity of those stories and the almost certainty scientifically and in all kinds of other facets that those things didn't happen. I remember reading a website on the global flood, and it listed every single problem from a science perspective, from a logistics perspective, and it just became, within one quick read, it just became impossible to hold it. And yet not only is the Book of Mormon holding some of those stories, but the Book of Mormon also has a completely different people from long ago separating and bringing those stories to us, which also we have to wrestle with, right?
and then there's Submarines.
So so if somebody says something like, "Hey, it's just a myth story," and everybody, now you have to kind of go back in time and go like, "Oh, the Jaredites carried the story, and these other people carried the story, and the story gets to us in two different timelines." It essentially becomes harder to believe. And then the other argument too is that when it comes to the global flood, it's Jesus himself who's mentioning it in I think 3rd Nephi. And so now you also have to bring Christ in and go like, Jesus is teaching a story that I no longer think even makes sense. It just becomes untenable. I mean, I really tried to make it work. I was dancing around this historicity aspect, and as soon as I saw that it was going to be that more complex to believe in Mormonism, it was just so much easier to see it as what it really is. I mean, the thing that I had noticed while studying both Mesopotamian religion and even some of the Egyptian influences on the Old Testament, you can see these clear parallels of where the Canaanites got the ideas or inspiration for their stories. I mean, even just in the creation myths, I mean, they borrowed heavily from the cultures that came before them, which makes complete sense because they migrated from Mesopotamia to Canaan. And so of course they're going to pull in the same pantheon of gods, just with slightly different names. Of course they're going to have the same flood story. Of course they're going to have all of these same ideas right there in scripture because their ancestors taught those same stories. Yeah. And so I'm interested to see how this all unfolds with you in this new podcast as you begin to jump into some of these stories, and I think we'll get into this in a moment, that your approach will be super kind and friendly to the believer, but with a goal in mind to say, like, let's look at what the data says on these things. Let's talk about some of the critiques that are out there. Let's talk about what issues run up against this stuff. And so let's maybe get into, at what moment do you think, like, hey, maybe I'll grab a microphone and a headset and maybe I'll start talking about things out loud and recording some of this stuff?
Yeah. So I guess the motive for this comes down to one of my favorite currently alive authors is Cormac McCarthy, and there's a phrase that he uses in both The Road and No Country for Old Men that he talks about carrying the fire. And in The Road, it's specifically the man is telling his son, when I'm gone, you have to carry the fire. And for me, this is the whole motive for it is it's my turn to carry the fire. It's my turn to share with the world the inspiration that I've received from you, Bill, from RFM, from all of these other podcasts and people that have inspired and helped me. I feel this intense drive to be that person for other people. Yeah,
I love it. And I think that, when I stopped doing much of the content that I was producing inside Mormon Discussion, and if I'm honest, the fact that I kind of moved into a space where I could no longer frame things giving just as much balance to kind of the faithful side as I did the critical side. And I really wanted, I just couldn't hold that space in a healthy way. And so I had to move on to some other place. And I've always wanted for someone to pick up some of that space behind me where I was. And I don't mean that in any negative way. I just think that there is room for podcasts that come in and try to be balanced in the perception to the believer, at least more so. Mm-hmm. And while I think you're going to tackle issues, honestly, I already gather that from you, that you're going to be true to the data. You're going to say, hey, like, when this doesn't add up, it doesn't add up. Let's be honest about it. Mm-hmm. But I do see also this articulation that makes space or acknowledges kind of the belief behind us and what goes into that. And so I'm really excited about this. Tell us about not only wanting to do a podcast, but why you chose the name Rameumptom Ruminations, which I think is really catchy. Yeah. And then also tell us maybe kind of what can we expect? Like, I know a few episodes have been mm-hmm. published. I would encourage folks to go out and listen to those. Maybe tell us a little bit about those and mm-hmm. some of the things that are coming down the pipe.
Yeah, so it's going to be called Rameumptom Ruminations. I really hung on to the word ruminations because that's what I do. When I read a book, when I watch a movie, or whatever art or literature it is, I ruminate over it. I stew over it. My wife gets upset with me when we're watching a show together because I can't binge watch. I have to sit and think about the episode before I can watch the next one. And I've always been that way. I just need to sit, think, analyze, understand exactly what's being said so that I can be ready for the next bit of information. Same thing, I'm reading a book, I'll finish a chapter, I'll stop, I'll think, oh wow, okay, this happened, that happened, this happened. And I'll try and understand exactly what the author, director, whatever it is trying to tell the audience. And I just ruminate. I sit there, I think. And so that really is just like, that word describes the way I process information. And Rameumptom, I just think, goes real well with it's got that alliteration, Rameumptom Ruminations.
Yeah, and I like too this idea, the Rameumptom in the Book of Mormon is this place where the person can stand up and essentially has the floor to say what they want to say. Mm-hmm. And when you run a podcast, when you're the host of a podcast, you get the chance for your voice to be heard, and it gets to be you kind of putting forth an idea and data around it, and giving the rest of us a chance to think about or ruminate on the things you're sharing.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So love it.
Yeah. And so for the second part of your question, the content that you'll expect. So I've got 3 episodes out right now. These ones are focusing a little bit more on philosophy and then critical analysis. The first episode, so it was the thought experiment, the ship of Theseus, and how that relates to religion and thought. And I kind of dissect what an organization really is. And a lot of the times people that leave the church, they criticize the church because it changes. And I don't think that's a real valid criticism, especially to an organization, because everything changes. So why wouldn't religion also change? And when you look at history, when you look at the history of any religion, of any culture, of any society, change is consistent. I mean, every culture adapts with every new generation, with every new technology, with every new idea. They're changing and constantly adapting. And so to assume that religion would be different than that is kind of taking it out of context of the rest of the world. And so I don't think that change, at least this is just my opinion, I don't think that change is necessarily the right criticism for religion. And so I put it into context of the ship of Theseus, which is the thought experiment of, as the ship ages and all of the boards of the ship have to be replaced, at what point does it become a new entity? And I stand that it doesn't ever become a new entity. And the way I relate it is with a river. As whenever, every time you look at a river, you're never seeing the same river twice. You're never seeing the exact same molecules of water twice, but we give it the same name. I drive across the Columbia River here every day for work, but I've never seen the same water in it.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point, because on one hand, Mormonism claims to be a religion that's led by revelation. Hence, even for those of us on the other side who have lost belief in it and walked away, we need to grant that Mormonism always said it had the ability to shift and change and to adjust, right? And there's some recognition that people like me on the post-Mormon side, who are really kind of almost to the point where we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater, we want it to change. We're demanding it change. We're doing marches asking it to change. And then when we change, we go, ha ha ha, look, it changed. Look, it did that. And
instead of celebrating it for making a good move.
Yeah, it can't do anything right. If it does the right thing, we go, look, it did the right thing, but look why, and look what it used to do, and we're always ready to pounce on it, regardless of whether it stands still or whether it's moving. And so I love that you're making space to acknowledge, like, hey, change isn't bad, and this thing always said it would change. Let's look at it beyond that concept, and let's look at what's actually changing, and let's talk about the substance of what's going on.
Of course. But as I discourse with believing members of the church, family members and what have you, the next real big change that the church needs to make is more acceptance of the LGBTQ plus community. And anytime I talk to them, I'm like, you guys know that the church already did something just as monumental when they gave Black members of the church the priesthood. Like, how is this any different than that? And so we just need to create a space where they can make these changes, because they need to. They have to, if they want to continue to be relevant in the world today.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little bit, I was talking for a moment kind of about your motives, but you tell us what your motives are. When people listen to Rameumptom Ruminations, what can they sense is going on in Scott Dyer's head?
Yeah, a lot of ruminations. I try and exist in a space where I'm going to give space for both a believer and a non-believer. I don't want to be the podcast that you go to get all of the facts, to get all of the information. I don't want to be the space where, for example, RFM, he does an excellent job of breaking down point by point, digging into the historicity, and just clearly stating out exactly how it happened. I want to create a space where you've listened to RFM, you know the facts, you know all of the sticky history, all of the hard truths. What do you do with them? And I want to create a space where you can come to my podcast, you can think about all of the hard aspects of church history, of even just belief in God. I've got an episode coming out next week where it's how do you reconcile the permanence of deity with the fact that religion changes, and then what would be the source of morality if religion changes? It's the Euthyphro dialogue with Socrates that I want to dig into. And so
if God is consistent, eternal, never changing, and prophets have access to him, why does a religion that has access to the consistent, eternal God constantly moving, shifting, adjusting?
Exactly. And it's an interesting dilemma that I love thinking about stuff like that, because a lot of times there's not a
Me
good
too,
answer.
brother.
So you get this dilemma. It's, what is the source of morality? Is morality bigger than God, or is God bigger than morality? And then what implications do each of those aspects have? And a lot of the times there's no clear answer. And if you lean one way or the other, there's problems with your thought on both ends of the spectrum. And so I just love presenting these paradoxes and these mind problems for people to come and sit down and think about. Because when you're going to church, you're going through your everyday life. You're sitting there in sacrament, listening to the talks and the speakers, or, just listening to a podcast about religion after you've deconstructed. You don't give yourself space to actually reconcile these problems or come to a healthy balance of kind of the awkward middle ground that you almost have to take if you break everything down. Because the whole reason that we all got baptized is because we felt something. Or if we were baptized as kids, the whole reason we stayed and got married in the temple is because at one point in time we believed it was true. And those revelations came from something. Was it just in our heads? Because that could be it. Was it from some outside source? It could be that too. I'm not here to give anyone the answers. I just want to present questions, present the dialogue for them to think about, and have the questions for them to ruminate themselves.
I love it. You've got a little thing here in the outline where you want to talk about methods for a moment. Maybe tell us kind of what is the way in which you're arriving at the ideas at which you're sharing with the audience.
So I love art and literature and movies. I have always been just an avid reader, and whenever I taught gospel doctrine or taught lessons in church, I always incorporated whatever book I was reading at the time into what I taught, and used quotes from real stories about life, and through this medium of understanding art and literature and philosophy, to understand our place in the world. And so my methods are going to be taking those things, taking art and stories, and looking at what messages we can learn from them to be better people and to understand maybe what's going on inside of our head a little bit better. I've been drafting an outline about emotional bypassing, and how the story "The Sun Also Rises" can teach us a little bit about emotional bypassing. That's an Ernest Hemingway story, and the end of the book is just so beautifully tragic and realistic, where a lot of the other characters are trying to emotionally bypass all of the trauma that the main character is going through, and then his response to it is just beautiful. And I think we can learn so much about the world around us and our position in it based on literature, based on art and philosophy. And if we stop and take the time to think about even, the movies and stories that we're watching on a regular basis that may not be intended to be, analyzed so thoroughly, oftentimes they have great meaning and value that we can incorporate into our own lives to understand this crazy world that we live in. And so that's kind of my method for breaking everything down.
I love it. I'm going to have to tune in for lots of good reasons, but one of them is to catch up on good literature so that I can be in the same space as Radio Free Mormon and know half the references he's making.
I can't say that I catch every reference he says, but I do understand a few of them.
You're catching more than I am, that's for sure.
Oh, man.
Well, I love it. And I love that you're bringing other stories in, because one of the things that was deeply helpful to me as I was in the middle of a faith transition and trying to think about all of this stuff was to begin to open myself up to other stories, other wisdom traditions, other philosophies, other ways in which people see the world. And once I got exposed to the world at large and stopped seeing solely through that lens of just Mormonism, I felt much safer. I felt much more empowered to be able to look at Mormonism and all the other things in my life, including my own mechanisms and behavior and just life, and begin to be able to kind of tackle those in more healthy ways. So I'm really appreciative that you're going to bring in other outside material as it relates to various topics. Talking about topics, what are some of the things we can kind of expect this podcast to cover?
So I will occasionally do like a critical analysis of like a truth claim. I want to go through all of the articles of faith and look at them as like a hypothesis, if you will, if they can be understood as like a claim, because not all of them can. We believe in God the Eternal Father. We can't verify if that's true or not. We can't. There's no process where you could go through and say, oh, this is true or this isn't true. But for example, the episode, one of the episodes that I came out with this last weekend was Harmonizing the Prophets, where I take a deep dive into Article of Faith 9 and break down if it's something verifiable that we can see if the prophets reveal the word of God to his people, and kind of look at them as if it's, these truth claims should be something that are testable for us to see if they're true or not. And so I'll dig deep into those as much as I can. I plan on going through all of the articles of faith at some point in time. I also want to go through all of the gospel topics essays, not to try and like break them down and tear everything down that they're saying, but I want to look and see what good things are they saying and what things might they need to improve on, or what things are just completely outright wrong and what things are pointing in a good direction. I want to be as fair as I can with a lot of this stuff. I want to, as I said, I want to create a space where this podcast, you might be able to share it with a believing friend who might know some of the issues, and they might get a different perspective on things, or be able to discuss it in a healthy way where I'm not going to tell them, hey, you have to disbelieve because X, Y, and Z. A lot of the times I will recommend, even though I don't believe, I will recommend a way to make it work, to see it in maybe a positive or a spiritual light. And so I plan on going through articles of faith, the gospel topics essays. I want to dialogue about some of the experiences that I've had, and just analyze things through a philosophical lens, quoting some of the great thinkers in our world, and what insights they can give us to both understand scripture, understand morality, and just create a safe space where both believers and non-believers can learn together.
There you have it, listeners. Scott Dyer, new host on Under the Umbrella of Mormon Discussion podcast, and under the podcast name of Rameumptom Ruminations. Scott, any last thoughts, any last words, anything else you want to add? Otherwise, people, just time to go check it out. The episode 1, The Good Ship Zion, and episode number 2 on covenants and the impermanence of things. Episode number 3, Harmonizing the Prophets. Those 3 are already published, and you should be able to, within the next few days, find this podcast in various third-party podcast apps, as well as just on the website itself, Rameumptomruminations.org. Any other thoughts from you, Scott?
The last thing I want to say is I am not afraid to be wrong. If I say something wrong, if I maybe interpret something wrong, and a listener wants to reach out and say, hey, you might have interpreted this the wrong way, I can make corrections. The only way that we can learn is if someone tells us that we've made a mistake, especially with our thinking or, with history, whatever it is. So I'm not afraid to post an episode, a year from now that says, hey, you remember right when I talked about harmonizing the prophets? My logic was so bad. Here, I'm just going to redo the whole thing, and this is a better version. So I want to create a space where I can be mistaken. Awesome.
So folks, if you're listening to the podcast, any kind of feedback, send back in. That's how we all get better at things anyway. And that kind of openness to self-correction, that's an important part of this side of things and being on the journey. So Scott Dyer, Rameumptom Ruminations. You can find it at Rameumptomruminations.org. Check out the podcast. Hope everybody loves it, but send us feedback and let us know how it's going. Scott, I'm just excited to have you aboard. The material that I've listened to thus far, you've got a great voice. You do a great job at putting thoughts together. You don't seem to be extremely nervous, which is really hard for folks who kind of jump into this space. You seem really comfortable. And you, again, as you pointed out, you've read a lot, thought a lot. And so the things you put across seem extremely thoughtful. And I just really appreciate the chance to work with you.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Bill. And again, thank you so much for bringing me into the family.
Perfect. Love it, folks. Check it out. Rameumptom Ruminations. Scott Dyer, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.